no matter how many molecules you can produce with early Earth conditions, plausible conditions, you're still nowhere near producing a living cell. And here's how I know. If I take a sterile test tube and I put in a little bit of fluid with just the right salts, just the right balance of acidity and alkalinity, just the right temperature, the perfect solution for a living cell, and I put in it one living cell. This cell is alive. It has everything it needs for life. Now I take a sterile needle and I poke that cell, and all its stuff leaks out into this test tube. You have in this nice little test tube all the molecules you need for a living cell. Not just the pieces of the molecules, but the molecules themselves. And you cannot make a living cell out of them. You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So what makes you think that a few amino acids dissolved in the ocean are going to give you a living cell? It's totally unrealistic.
In simplistic terms, these creationists seem to think that the mere existence of an irreversible reaction disproves evolution. The answer to this specific question is of course trivial. The bacteria is not a simple organism. It's a grizzled heavyweight that has survived 4 billion years in an environment of harsh competition and is one of the most durable organisms on Earth. Now perform this same experiment with the bacteria's primitive relatives 4 billion years back, in the times when it was debatable whether it should be classified as life or merely a few primitive, inefficient, self-replicating reactions, and this would have arguably produced a different result. Further, such an experiment should really take into account the planetary quantities of organic matter on Earth, not merely a test tube. Most of the organic matter on Earth was organic long before it was living organic matter. There was still about 500 billion tons of organic matter on Earth before life. And for those who are kind of fuzzy what organic matter is, it's largely any compound of carbon, methane, ethane, methylamine, methanol, etc. And in the molecular composition of the universe, these compounds are not even remotely rare. However, in metaphorical terms, claiming the inability of an irreversibly burst cell to reassemble as proof that abiogenesis is impossible is like claiming that if Galileo and co-workers were given a laptop with all the knowledge necessary to build a space probe, then their inability to build that space probe, basically an irreversible reaction, would prove that it's impossible to build space probes. Galileo lived in the days before electricity, before the days of the discovery of atoms or even chemistry, before the days of Newtonian physics, all those tough rules of motion like the harder you shove it the faster it moves, and if you don't do anything to it then nothing happens. Rules of motion that took civilization about 4,000 years to work out. Before the days of mechanical engineering and materials, before the days of water treatment, in the days when the only things that flew were birds and so on. Now put that same laptop in the team of NASA engineers and they could easily construct a probe. But to Galileo and co-workers it would have been a few hours of magical light, and then after that an interesting sculpture made of bizarre metals and strange non-wooden materials. Indeed, the growth of knowledge makes an interesting metaphor for evolution. Good ideas are kept and propagated in the collective mind of the superorganism, while bad ones are generally discarded. It is primarily this informational evolution that has built our civilization, which we are almost entirely dependent on. However, our dependence on the infrastructure is also a weakness of the superorganism. Destroy the infrastructure and, crucially, the knowledge to rebuild it, and we live like tribal apes again. This point is something I was made aware of in my youth. When I was growing up in the UK, there was a real threat of a third world nuclear war.
If attack is imminent, you will hear the attack sound like this.
We had what was called the 4-minute warning, which was about the warning you would get before the nukes started going off in the UK. Most of the public warning videos focused on what those near the target should do, and what those downwind of them, who would get whacked by the fallout, should do. However, the macroscopic calculations were different. What would be truly devastating for the UK was not the blast or the fallout, but the destruction of infrastructure. The UK currently has a population of about 60 million. Without the infrastructure, electricity, water supply, unhindered modern agriculture and imports, it can support about 6 million. The approximate death toll from a nuclear strike and fallout would kill about 10 million. The significant majority would have died from loss of infrastructure. Without the infrastructure, the superorganism cannot survive in its current state. The mechanism which enabled this destructive possibility was, of course, discovered by scientists, albeit at a time when such a project would have received almost universal public support, given that it was known that the Nazis were working on similar weapons. Only those inexperienced in game theory would have played the high moral ground there. However, ultimately, enough of these devices were made to destroy our entire infrastructure and take us back to the Stone Age. Thankfully, those who made the decisions were familiar with the no-win situation. Once summed up by Saginists, it's like two sworn enemies, one with 3 matches, the other with 5, standing waist-deep in gasoline. Since then, our infrastructure has flourished and allowed us to achieve great things. This is the paradox of creationism. Without the first world infrastructure built on science, it's doubtful whether they would live long enough to field an opinion on the subject. And even if they did, it's doubtful whether they would have enough time left, after trying to find enough food to survive the winter, to preach the evils that science brings by leading people away from their particular brand of creationism. Basically, the only reason we have people like preachers is because our infrastructure feeds, waters and keeps these people clean, warm and healthy. And then in an act of supreme ingratitude, they use the time that they would have otherwise spent trying to stave off starvation to attack the very scientific method responsible for providing their last meal.
That's right. Love of God and compassion and empathy leads you to a very glorious place. Science leads you to killing people.
Yeah, good word, good word.
However, if it were merely ingratitude, I wouldn't have too much trouble with creationism. But by attacking the scientific method, they undermine our ability to harden and advance the infrastructure of our civilization. Few who have insight into the vulnerability of life on Earth, let alone the knife edge our civilization is balanced on, would be bold enough to claim that we are capable of surviving any challenge thrown at us. Civilization has been good to me, and I want it to live, thrive and survive long beyond my life. Life, let alone intelligent life, is so exceptionally rare in our universe that it would be a tragedy, almost the most abhorrent crime, to let such a gem fail simply because mine stood idle while snake oil salesmen sold the comfortable fantasy that an invisible super sky daddy would take care of all of their problems if they telepathically told them that they loved him. Those conmen and daydreamers intimidated by reality, whose vision does not extend beyond the blink of an eye of the individual life and into the future of mankind.
Let me say something about Harry Potter. Warlocks are enemies of God. And I don't care what kind of hero they are. They're an enemy of God. And had it been in the Old Testament, Harry Potter would have been put to death.
Those without the vision to understand that simply because our civilization looks stable to the eyes of a human, that they think that this means the status quo will persist indefinitely. Not only are these creationists willfully ignorant in acknowledging the quality of life that the scientific method has delivered them, they are willing to attack it and to undermine the potential of our civilization to deal with the unknown challenges that it will undoubtedly face. They make real scientists waste their time dealing with the intentional disinformation sown by braying creationist arguments, specifically targeted at those who do not have the education to realize that these arguments were intellectually gutted decades ago. They are willing to jeopardize the future ability of our infrastructure and the survivability of our civilization simply so they can indulge in their comfortable fantasies. Their religion may not have any morals or ethics about the future of our civilization, but I do. As your God was clearly too involved to give you any clear guidance on this, allow a man whose magic would have made any Bronze Age miracles seem like cheap party stunts to give you a word of advice. Believe whatever you want to believe, but temper it with the perspective of the standard of living delivered to you by materialistic science. Remember that science does not preclude you from indulging in whatever fantasies blow your metaphorical skirt up. So do not hamstring those who dedicate their lives to the development of the infrastructure we all rely on for our survival and for our quality of life, and which ultimately may hold the balance of the future existence of life on Earth.